Hello everyone, welcome. It's Thursday again. There we go. Although as the sun is coming out in the northern hemisphere, I have a feeling that lots of people are going to start to have barbecues instead of editing, but there we go. So welcome to another week. We're going to be editing for the next 1 hour in Capture One. Capture One being the raw editor that's made by the guys in Denmark. And currently that version is version 21.1. So again, we always start off with a couple of caveats. So number one, please be as interactive as you wish. Just a couple of things on today's session. So I was testing this with David Grover earlier. There may be a few things that look a little bit different. I'm hoping not. But one thing that is different is my two buttons to add a comment to a broadcast and ban someone are right next to each other. So yay, progression in software. So if I do accidentally ban someone, really sorry about that. We'll try and fix it later. So that's number one. There's a couple of new things happening today. Number two, there's about a 8 to 10 second delay on anything that you type appearing on my screen in time for me to respond and you see the answer. So if you put in a comment or a question as we go, and I'd encourage you to, especially when we're editing images, then please just bear in mind there's a little bit of a delay. I'm not ignoring you. It's just that's how live streaming works. So Capture One 21.1 is the current version of Capture One. It's the version that if you're on a subscription model, you should really be running because it's the latest. If you're on version 20, which is the previous version of Capture One, you'll be able to follow along with most of the stuff we're doing today, apart from a couple of things that I'll highlight. Otherwise, there's an option, obviously, to upgrade to 21. If you're on a previous version, so version 12 or before, there may be some substantial differences, so you just want to be aware of that before you go on. For those of you that don't have Capture One, you can download a free trial, completely free trial, 30 days. Go to capture1.com. It's fully functional, and then you can go. Okay, let's have a little look into our images for today. So first one, Tom. Let's have a look at this image. It's from Switzerland. And the question from Tom was around cropping and getting the best out of this shot. So Tom's actually really handily sent in 3 different crops. So we've got this one. We've got a slightly wider one, and then we've got a more 3:2 aspect ratio. So in terms of these 3 shots, I think the crop, as it were, if that's the question, for me, it's got to be this one here. Simply because we're not getting in a load of this stuff on the right. If that was the intention, then great, but there's not enough of it to really hold a presence in the image. This one here, we're getting a lot more reflection, but it's got a similar issue here with this great big umbrella just in the top corner of the image. So we could have done this as April Fool's and talked about sky replacement, but we're not. We're going to do this as sky, let's call it creation or augmentation, either way you want to look at it. And it's around how we get rid of this umbrella out of the shot. Now, one of the things that a lot of people have asked about is when's the right time to crop. I know a lot of people have problems with the healing brush when the heal automatically takes an area from outside of your crop. So let me give you that example. If I were to try and get rid of this umbrella, well, let's just choose this area here. So I've chosen my healing brush at the top and just healed it over there. And it's done a pretty good job. I'm going to choose another bit up here. It's done a pretty good job. Well, sorry, it's not done a pretty good job, but it's kept the origin in the image. This third one here, and don't get me wrong, I'm intentionally getting it wrong. But let's just have a look. On this one here, I can see this origin is going to here on the right. In this one here, this origin is going to here on the right. This third one, I can't find the origin. The reason I can't is because the origin is outside of the crop. And that's a real challenge for people when they're trying to make changes, because when I switch into crop mode, I now can't use the healing anchors. So what I've effectively got to do is just undo all of those changes. But if I wanted to, let's just clone that variant. If I wanted to find that crop, or sorry, the healing tool, and it was outside of my crop, effectively what I'd have to do is undo the crop so that I can get back to my healing brush and find its origin. And that's a real problem because you've spent all that time doing the crop. So there's 2 ways around this in Capture One. One is that we could force Capture One, I guess, in future. It's not there yet. But in future, we could force Capture One to only allow the source for a heal or a clone to be inside the crop. That may work for some, might not for others though. The second is we can manually force where we want to take the area from. So on my healing brush, I don't have to allow this automatic healing location. I can use the Alt key or the Option key on a Mac, hold down the source location, and then click in the destination. No problem. So if I'm working on a cropped image, the safest thing to do if I know I want to take content from within the crop is to do the manual source and destination, which is the Option key or the Alt key on your keyboard. So in this case, I could choose here and paint there. I could, again, Option key or Alt key, click here for the source and click there for the destination. So if I'm working in a crop, that's a safe way of doing it. The second way is probably the more obvious way, which is do your healing before you make any crop decisions. So if I do the crop last, or certainly after healing, it's going to help because Capture One's only able to grab content that's within the frame anyway. So in this case, actually, to make it a bit easier, I'm actually going to uncrop us. So let's come out to here. And in fact, what we're going to do is we'll keep it at its 1:2 aspect ratio. Maybe out to there. And I'm going to use all this extra space on the sky to get rid of this umbrella out of the shot. So let's have a little look at what we can do to start with. Now remember as well that whenever you're healing or cloning, it's healing from the raw. So if I go back to the before and after, so press Y on your keyboard or press the before and after button on the top right. If I use that function, I can see all the changes that Tom's made. Quite significant. Certainly the white balance has changed, but there's also all of these layers. It's got some Luma ranges on here to bring things out into detail in the mountain. Really good stuff in terms of brightening areas and darkening areas to give us this final image from what was a pretty, let's call it unbalanced white balance out of the camera. So remember that when you're on the healing brush, it's always going to use the raw data. You can't heal from a heal, effectively. It doesn't work cumulatively. So if I replace a bit of sky, I can't use that replaced sky to now replace another bit of sky. It always goes back to the raw underlying data. And that's something that trips people up with multiple heal layers. So let's create a new heal layer. And I'm going to say I want to take this source, so the Option key or Alt key, and I'm going to paint it in here. Now the heal brush instead of the clone brush has an advantage, which is it will try and blend in with its surroundings rather than just copy like for like. So where we're seeing here, I've not let go of the mouse button, what we're seeing is the pre-adjustment version of the data that it's going to grab. Let go, and now it's made the adjustments to blend it in with the rest of the scene. And it's actually done a pretty good job. We could go a little bit higher up here, but you now see we're starting to clip this one here from there. Now, as I say, I can't, unfortunately, redo another heal on top of this, so I can't take another part of it and heal over the top. But what I can do is use our stamp tool, our clone tool, to stamp on top again. So I can go into my clone tool and paint there, and I could do another source. So again, same with the repair tool or the healing tool. If you hold down the Option key, and you have to on clone, tell it a source, you can then paint into a destination. Now equally, what you can also do obviously is do clone and heal on the same image, but just be careful that you're not going to get a little bit away from yourself when you start painting too many things in. Okay, so effectively what I've now done is I've created a fake sort of square around here. If I turn these two layers off, we can see what was there before through to what's there now. We've got a lot more space. To a smart eye, they're going to notice that this cloud is the same as that cloud, so that's one thing to bear in mind. One of the Joe's questions. So how much healing should we do at all? Yeah, so this is the $1 million question, isn't it? When it comes to, so I actually apply the same argument to a landscape as what I would do, or when I used to shoot portraits. So if something is temporary by nature, so what I mean by that is if someone has a blemish on their skin, or maybe a cut or something that's healing, Or maybe, I don't know, they've got a mark or something, or something that's, maybe they've twisted funny and there's a little bit of a weird sort of wrinkle or something like that. It's temporary by nature. You wouldn't paint it in if you were painting their portrait, so I'd probably be tempted to get rid of it. Same with a landscape. If there's a piece of litter, if there's, in this case, frankly, these umbrellas that are just in the way, if Tom could have moved a little bit to the left, and he would have got very wet, I'm guessing, but if we could have moved a little bit, maybe that umbrella wouldn't be in the scene. If the umbrella was down, then it wouldn't be in the scene. So all those things tell me that this is a temporary issue. On that basis, I'm happy to heal it out. What I wouldn't be happy healing out is this mountain, for example. The swans, up to you, but I'd sort of be in a place where if it's temporary by nature, and if you came back, let's use a different test, if you came back another day, might it not be there? And if the chances are it wouldn't be, then I don't have a problem with healing it out. So that, but again, that's my view, not necessarily the official answer. I don't know who has the official answer. I know, for example, in some of the documentary photography awards and stuff like that, you have to send in actually the JPEG out the camera as well as the RAW to prove what the camera actually saw at the time. You can't even move a piece of straw for that, because you're documenting something. It should be accurate to that time. For landscape photography, there's a bit more lenience, but don't. Oops. Trying to make everyone feel a little bit sick again. It's just mouse. Don't go removing entire buildings and clouds and all this other stuff. Just be careful with that. Okay. So with that done, we can now go back and redo that crop. So if the crop is still at our 2x1, so remember on cropping, you can do it unconstrained. There's no reason or force that you have to do it in a certain aspect ratio. But if you want to stick to an aspect ratio, just hold your mouse button over the crop tool. You can choose from these, or you can create your own. You can go to add aspect ratio as well. In this case, 1x2, good. And let's just pull in our shot here. And I think that was roughly where we were at before. Now, I'd actually argue with that change that we could afford for a bit more reflection. So we could actually push it to be 3x2, or 2x3 as it is in the list. So if we do that, let's come down here. And up to there. That's looking pretty good. Now I want a bit more of that umbrella to be gone. So this is the problem you see with cropping and trying to work out cropping versus healing. It's a bit of an iterative process. If I go back to my heal layer and see what we healed out, well, we got rid of that. But unfortunately, we've taken it from this area here, which is also bringing in some of this umbrella. So instead of that, I'm going to use a new healing area, source from there, Option key or Alt key, and paint this umbrella out here when it goes. Cool. So it's enough effectively for me to get away with it, and that's what we're actually talking about here. I could argue we could maybe even get rid of that clone layer. If I go back to our healing layer and see whether or not we could get rid of it. Let's have a little play. If I erase this part, oops, sorry, not that one, from here, let's erase that. And instead, I'm going to choose a new source location. So again, with my healing brush, source here, and we'll paint in there, and another source, and we'll paint over there. And you'll see what's happening. We're sort of building up layers of different sources to get different content that smooths into the image. And each time, if I want to make sure that I'm using the right bit of content, I've got to choose my origin. So in this case here with the cloud, we've got that origin. But actually on that one, I'm just going to remove quite a lot of what I painted in there on that umbrella. Because unfortunately it's starting to darken things down over here. So let's just move that in there. Maybe into there. Maybe we can get to something better. And then finally, I'm going to go back to my stamp tool. So we are going to use our clone layer. Choose a source. Oops, sorry. Choose a source there. I'm going to increase our size of our brush and soften it down. So if we want the stamp to blend in, of course it's going from the raw data. If we want it to blend in, then unfortunately we've got to have a soft edge. And oh man, talk about making this more difficult than I thought it was going to be for myself. Effectively, we're now in that trap, and we're in the trap that I didn't want people to fall into, which is trying to chase the heel or the clone. So actually what I'm going to do, we're going to undo quite a few steps here, and we're going to get back to a place where we have our umbrella still in, and we're just going to correct a couple of small things I noticed as we were going. So let's think about what we've got here. We've got a couple of layers of healing that are unfortunately conflicting with each other. If I were to get rid of both these, and now we know what we're trying to achieve, let's just go on to here. I'm going to choose this bit of sky here with a heal there, and we're going to paint out that top umbrella there. Good. Now I'm going to choose this bit of sky with a smaller brush here and paint out this cloud further here out towards the umbrella. And I'm just going to be careful that we don't clip too much of that secondary umbrella at the top, because we're going to stop here anyway, right? So then I've got one tiny little thing to do, which is use our stamp tool to just get rid of a couple of bits that need tidying up. So a bit there, just into there, not grabbing any of the cloud. And then what we're going to do is something that people don't do very much of, which is use a lower opacity on that stamp to blend in. I'm not worried about this at the top because it's not going to be in our crop, but I am worried about blending in some of this stuff down here. Okay, so let's then pull this down into our 2x3 up to the top of that cloud. We might want to do a little bit of tidying up maybe later, but we're in a place where we've got rid of that great big umbrella that was hanging out within the image. We couldn't have done that from within this crop. You needed that extra information that was out here on the top of the sky. Without that extra information, there's nowhere that this could use as a reference to fill in that sky. So we talk about, and I think, who was it that said on there? I think Paula, Paula's just said, pre-crop an image with guides just for this purpose. So yeah, it's a really suitable way of doing it. So let's go back to our crop. So we can see here, this is the whole image. Well, what I could do, of course, let me just create a new variant. Let's imagine we had our original image out here. What Paula's talking about is using our guides to say, well, actually, I know that I'm going to be coming into there and coming into there, for example, this top corner. So if I know that, I can then work to this area without trying to guess it, fix all that area in the sky, and then when I come down to my real crop, without those guides, it's nice and clean. So it's a way of doing your crop effectively visually, but without actually cropping the image, because when you crop the image, it can be difficult to grab those heels from elsewhere. Okay, where are we? Schnitzel TV's just said, you did not see everything that can be seen in the picture on site. You also unconsciously faded out some things. Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, it's human nature. So if, for example, if I look at this picture here, or let's go to here, I wouldn't see that umbrella. You know, exactly right. Because our mind is designed to look at the scene. That sort of fades into insignificance. It's only when you look at the picture later on that the umbrella becomes a bit of an issue. So that's how, you know, we'd get it. It's the only change really I'd make on this, Tom. You know, in theory, we could, let's have a look at our background layer. We could, in theory, go to our blues and just richen them up a little bit, pull their lightness down just to get a bit more contrast in the sky. You know, again, in theory, you've already got your sky layer here. We could, on our exposure tab, go into our clarity adjustment and just push that a little bit there. That's going to give those clouds a bit more of a pop. In theory, we could take the whites up a little bit on that area as well for the clouds. But they're all changes that I'm making almost for the sake of making a change. It doesn't need that to keep the image correct. What it did need is what you did in the first place, which was that big white balance change. And a lot of the detail out here in the mountain. But overall, you know, that would be the only thing that I'd be tempted to do, which is to get rid of that in the top right. Okay, next up, Gerry's rainbow. So this is again, it's a previously edited image. Again, I don't know whether maybe in the last couple of weeks all cameras have had a white balance issue. They've all gone more blue than they should have been. But yeah, so I've seen a lot of pictures come in this time with a certain shift to a cool white balance for some reason. I don't know whether it's because people have left their white balance on a daylight session or a version or something like that. But what Gerry's already done, quite rightly, is pull up that white balance, get it reset. You can use the picker to do that, but it's also just as easy to use these sliders. And we can effectively warm up or cool down this picture even more if we wanted to. But the question for Gerry was how to effectively make this more dramatic. And there's a couple of ways. So the first is, and this is a really easy one, you've already drawn this edge over the rainbow, Gerry. The only thing that I'm worried about with this little mask here is effectively it's got quite a hard border on it. So what I'd be tempted to do is to take my eraser, reasonably low opacity, a really soft edge, and a medium size, just to start erasing some of this edge work here, so I don't have quite such a hard line on it. And you'll see why in a second. So this is all about just softening in, and in fact the bigger the brush size, the softer that edge is going to be. So the less of a fall off you're going to get on those corners. And in fact there's a bit of the rainbow missing down here in the bottom right. So we're just going to do that to soften those edges. So what you can see on the mask while it's happening is effectively we're just feathering out those edges with a low opacity. So every time I click is another set of that opacity with a really soft edge so that we don't notice that fall off. I'm also then going to add in, so with my brush tool, B for brush. So again, reasonable size brush, really soft brush. And my opacity actually I'm going to put up pretty high on here to maximum. And we're just going to add in all of this here. Is there a Luma? Yeah, there's a Luma range on there. I'll show you that in a second. So there's our new soft rainbow. Okay. Now, what I mentioned just then as I started brushing, you could see it. Well, why on earth is that gap appearing? Well, actually, it makes perfect sense. There's a Luma range applied to this layer. So if I go into this Luma range, we can see it's only selecting certain ranges of tone within this image, certain brightnesses. So those brightnesses, unfortunately, mean that whatever I do with the brush over here, if it doesn't fall within this range, it's not going to be accepted. It's not going to be part of the mask. So if I start to pull this, I'm not sure whether it's down or up. It may be the up side. Interesting. I have to redraw over the top. New. Okay, so within that Luma range now, it now sits, no issue. It's now included within that range. It's included within what we're brushing. So we now get the whole lot. With that softer area on the end, I'm tempted now that we can push this rainbow layer a bit more. So we can afford to push our saturation up a little bit. In fact, what I'm going to do is just give you a bit of a before and after here in a second. We can do it from there. So pull up our saturation on the rainbow layer. Remember that saturation, this saturation slider in Capture One is not a pure saturation slider. It's doing a bit like vibrance. It's being a bit more clever than just pumping up all the colors. But the thing that really makes rainbows stand out against clouds is this tool here, clarity. So don't ever overlook the clarity tool. Now, if you push it too far, it's a bit over the top to say the least. But we can get it up to about 30, no problem. And what you're going to get is just a bit more pop on those bits that are really, really bright and colorful. So if I go to our before and after, we can now see how strong that looks. It almost has like a polarizing effect on that rainbow. So it just brings out the detail a lot more. That's it. Now, the next thing, in terms of making this come to life a bit more, is potentially using our new brush, so our style brush. So we've got a deep sky style brush. I'm not suggesting we use this on every picture, obviously, but I'm going to show you a little trick here. And a lot of people, unfortunately, have fallen into the trap of thinking this only works with brushing. So if I go to a relatively big brush, let's put a low opacity down, fine for now. It defaults to 100%, but let's just do that. Okay, if I turn my mask on, That's showing me here that it's all everywhere. Now I could keep brushing over the sky and I could try and get a nice edge around things, so I don't want to darken the foreground. I want a nice soft fall off, so I might go over it with a soft flow, or I can just add a gradient. So remember, these style brushes, they work on layers. That layer is no different to any other layer. So that layer, I can use a gradient to change the value of my style brush. So everyone at the moment is really, really concentrating on trying to paint in really accurate style brushes. And then when you want to blend it into something else, they're using flow and opacity and going over and over and over again to try and get things fixed. Or you can click once with the brush to create the style brush layer, in this case deep sky, and then you can switch to the gradient tool. Switch to the gradient tool, and we've got all of these controls. So if I hold down the Option key, I can pull off this fall off to be a little more severe down at the bottom, let's call it that. Now I've got a really nice fall off of that gradient, so 100% at the top, down to 50% here, and down to 0 down here. If I want it to be even softer, well, I can go back to my gradient tool, and I can hold down the Option key to do this as well, and we can have a much softer fall off of the deep sky style brush. So there is something here and I don't know whether I missed talking about it originally, in fact thinking about it, but I don't think we've talked about the fact that style brushes are effectively a set of changes on a layer. That layer has a mask that it happens to be done by the brush in a style brush layer, but it can equally be done by a gradient mask, by a Luma range. You can do all of those things to that layer just like you could any other layer. It's just a default way of getting, in this case, that deep sky look onto this shot. With that done, then I'm tempted with the overall image. Actually, we haven't got any risk really of any exposure hitting 255. We could do it with levels already. So already Gerry has pulled up a lot of this stuff to be a little bit brighter. I'm just going to push it a little bit more with exposure overall, maybe 0.2, something like that. And there we go. We get to a place where, here's our original. There's our new. Is the rainbow more vivid? Yes. Is the sky more dramatic? Yes. In theory, I could actually push up a little bit more clarity in that sky too. Remember, because it's got a gradient layer, it's going to affect the top more than the bottom. But if I wanted it to affect the bottom more, then I could rasterize that layer and I could use the brush to add that bit or extra bit in. But that gives us our vivid rainbow and dramatic sky. How much you want of that? Well, of course, you can dial back the opacity on all of these layers. So as long as you keep them separate on the layers, then you're in a good place. Okay, so from there, talking about dramatic skies, let's have a look at Dominique's sky. So love this one. This is cool. So sometimes you just got to be in the right place before you get very, very wet. Let's have a look at our before and after. So Dominique's already made some changes on here. So we've got 2 adjustment layers. We've got one for the foreground here and one for this sky. The sky's got some clarity in this cloud, and the foreground has had its exposure lifted. Where I was a couple of years ago. Where are we, Martin? Yeah, style brush and a layer. Now the upgrade to 21 is worth it. Honestly, I don't know how to say this in a way that it comes across as vividly as I want it to, which is I don't think people have understood how useful those style brushes can be. If you forget the word brush, and almost stupid, forget the word brush and forget the word style, you're left with nothing. But actually, it's serious. Styles have been in Capture One for ages, but they're global styles. Brushes have been in Capture One for ages, but then you'd brush on a layer and you'd have to make those adjustments. A style brush allows us to apply loads and loads and loads of different adjustments again and again and again to different images. It's better than a preset because a preset was only on one tool. It's better than the style because this can be selective. So with a style brush, make all of your adjustments, make some really cool stuff, and know that, yes, you can paint them on with a brush, but you can also fill the entire layer with it. You can use a gradient with it. You can use a Luma range with it. You can do all those things to get something that's, pretty good. And more importantly, it's repeatable again and again for the same sort of look. Andrea's just asked, is there a way to make a layer from a focus mask? Not that I am aware of. Sorry, Andrea. So yeah, you can view the focus. In fact, if you don't have it on your toolbar, if you go to customize, you will find here focus mask. Let's just add it up there so you can see it. So if I turn on my focus mask, you should see, let's just go to one that's got a bit more of an obvious focus. So in this case here, all of the green stuff is what Capture One has flagged as. These are the sharpest areas of the image. They're the bits that are in focus. We can't create a mask from the bits that are in focus, to my knowledge, at the moment. But there we go. For those that didn't know, that's what the focus mask is. So let's go back to Dominique's shot, and I'm just going to clone this so that we can have a little comparison after. And I want to do two things. Number one, it's very rare that I say this. I want to go a bit heavier on this sky. I want to push that a bit more. Number two, I really want to pull out a lot more detail with this this guy in the foreground. Is it a surfer? Yeah, someone waiting to surf. That could get interesting. Okay, so we've already got a foreground layer. If I press my mask button, so M for mask, we can see our foreground layer. Great. And that foreground layer has actually got... Oh, maybe I actually did this already. Dominique, I'm actually... Oh, blimey. I played with this earlier. You're actually seeing the things that I already played with. There we go. So you can now see where we got to. Let's have a little look. So here was our base image. There's already a load of clarity on there. So if I go to before and after, that's embarrassing, isn't it? I was actually playing with my edits already. So there's our before. This is actually the original shot. We're going to undo this so you can actually see what we did step by step, because otherwise that's not going to teach anyone anything. So there's our original. And there you go. It's April the 1st. April Fools. You thought that was already edited. Here is the change with just clarity. So just clarity loaded in. You can see the amount that pops in that cloud. Clarity is great for this stuff. It adds drama, it adds contrast changing, it adds a load of detail in there, but it can also create those things called halos that we refer to, which aren't very nice. In a stormy sky like this, it doesn't really matter because those halos are falling into the shadows anyway, so you can get away with it, frankly. That's the word that I'd use. To a certain extent. Okay, so that's our overall clarity on the overall image. But I want to go a bit further, as you've already seen the preview of. So first off, let's create a layer called foreground. I'll label them this time so that we know what we're doing. I'm going to use our gradient tool up here, and I'm just going to draw a very quick layer that's just our foreground. In fact, we can have a bit more of a fall off just to be really careful with it. Let's move down to there. Okay, so there's our mask for foreground. And let's imagine I want to pull up our exposure. Great. But I want to make sure that this surfer is still in silhouette. So for those of you that had a keen eye just now, you'll have seen what we did. Here's my mask. I want to exclude the surfer. Well, very easy. We've got a Luma range tool. So if I pull my Luma range to include everything that's bright up here, and exclude anything that is dark to the point where the surfer is cut out. But here's the problem. Let's go to there. So a really harsh fall off in this case. Bit of a soft radius on the edges, so almost like feathering the edges. So I've got my wonderful setup here with the surfer gone, but because these are the same amounts of luminosity as that surfer, they're also excluded. That's a problem. So we're going to apply this to start with. And what I'm also going to do once that's applied, he says, oh, come on. It's almost like it is actually April the 1st. So our Luma range seems to have crashed. Let's come out of that. And you get a lovely little crash bug or crash log. And we are going to, right now I'm not going to send that bug. But here's a fun learning thing. Genuinely, if your Capture One crashes, I talked about this the other day, please let Capture One know. Do the crash bug or crash logs. Do send the anonymous stuff across so they can have a look at it. But there we go. That is our April Fools. We'll go with that. So here is my layer. Let's go back to our Luma range and let's increase those rates so that we've excluded this surfer. And I'm going to put a soft radius on the edge so it doesn't look like that it's completely cut out, and hit apply. There we go. But as I said, we've got this problem here with this wave. So with the wave, we've got the ability to get rid of it, but not through a Luma range, because this is the same amount of luminosity as that surfer is. But what we can do is we can right click on this layer and say rasterize the mask. That sets that Luma range as the mask. Go to my brush tool. Now I can fill in. Let's just make sure we've got a decent amount of opacity. I can fill in the rest of it, because that Luma range is now no longer applicable. Now, of course, I could have cut out around the surfer if I wanted to, but that Luma range has just made that cutout really, really accurate without me having to do any masking. So use the Luma range, get rid of the stuff that you don't want, and then fill in the gaps after rasterizing it. And then you've got a nice, neat layer. We can also use our eraser, of course, and just really neaten up that horizon now. So I can go across to here, and there we go. Cool. Barry's saying hang in there for, I don't know what is going on today, but there we go. So we've now got our foreground layer that I can lighten up, and I can use the exposure tool to do that. And now we've got that brightness in the foreground without affecting that surfer. I don't want to bring that surfer up again. I want them to stay as a silhouette. Next one, cloud. We're back on script now. There we go. So with our cloud, let's go to our brush. Again, really, really, really soft brush. Low hardness, zero hardness. Opacity, I'm going to put a reasonable amount, and we'll do that in terms of its size. I'm going to press M to see my mask as I'm drawing, and all I'm doing is just following the swirls, but I'm going to get heavier where the cloud is a bit heavier. And as a change from before, I'm actually going to add in a bit more up here as well. With that clarity layer, well, sorry, with that cloud layer, we're going to use it as a clarity layer, and I'm going to go over the top, don't worry, intentionally really boost that. So we can pull it up. In this case, I said we're going to push it a bit, so we're going to go up to here. That brings in a huge amount of drama into this scene that you didn't have before. Finally, on this one, let's go to our vignette, which we actually already had on, but there we go. So our vignette, that's the one thing that I added probably first off, in order to make sure that the whole image started to close in. Remember that your vignette, it actually doesn't matter what layer you're on. So your vignette goes across background, foreground, cloud, whatever. If you make a change to vignetting down here, it makes no difference which layer you're on, and it will apply to the whole image. If you want a vignette that's selective on a layer, you need to use a radial gradient mask instead. Right, so before and after. Let's go on to our before shot there and our after shot there. In my head, that looks a lot more dramatic. We've got a lot more detail, certainly down here. It's really actually brought that surfer to be a subject in this, as well as that cloud. Look how cool that cloud looks. And I think, for the sake of sanity, we need to move away from Dominique's really nice image and move on to something that doesn't crash, I haven't done before, and let's get on from there. So, excellent image to move on to, Paul's shot. So Paul the barber from Warwick. So Paul sent this in as a result of lockdown, all the stuff that he's been doing. And actually, to Andrea's point, no, we are never doing another webinar on April the 1st again. Good point, Andrea. Good point, James. Right, Paul's shot of this. It's old-fashioned shaving equipment and so on. Paul's question was, do we think this is ready to print? How am I doing? And so on. I found about 3 or 4 things that I might tweak on this, if I'm honest, Paul. But I wouldn't touch them, and I don't want to touch this image. I think you've done an amazing job of it. We're going to deconstruct it in a second, but you'll be most people will be surprised when they see the original. So could this be printed on the wall of a barber shop? Absolutely. It looks amazing. It's a really nice shot. You've done well with the reflections as well. This stuff is difficult to photograph. There is a bit of an issue here with an overexposed part here. But the fact is, you're photographing something that's literally reflecting any and all light back at you. You've already done a pretty good job. You've used the recovery tools here to pull back highlights and whites. Don't forget with HDR, you can actually add on. I can do another one and call it HDR2. I can actually double down effectively with it. So let's just add a reasonable flow. Let's just add a couple of mask points here and here. And even though my highlights and recoveries were at -100, -100, on my HDR2, I can do it again. I can pull down whites and highlights again. And you might see that, you know, there's without, there's with. It's up to you whether you want to do it, but to me, it's not going to have a huge material effect on this shot at all. It's just an option. If you really want to pull back HDR, you can use a doubling effect of that HDR tool to pull back even more dynamic range on your camera. But here's the thing, for everyone watching, here's the before. Now the before is a nice shot, but it doesn't look quite as traditional, quite as aged, quite as cool on a wall, let's put it that way. Here's Paul's after with all of those changes on it, and it is stunning. So what he's done, we've got obviously our background layer, and we talked about he's pulled up some contrast. He's desaturated the whole image, and we'll talk about that in a second. He's pulled down the highlights by 100 and the whites. So effectively all of this stuff, recovering all that detail, all that data from those bright areas, and even in here. And what that's done is it's brought back this nice soft tone because the camera captured all that data. It's just within the standard 255, that RGB histogram, what we look at up here. The problem with it is, unfortunately, some of that falls outside of that range. So by using the HDR tool, you can pull all that detail back in and not have so much overexposed. A little bit of clarity, and that's sort of it for the basic edit. But what he's also done, remember he's desaturated by -78. That's almost a black and white image. Let's have a look at our color tab. And what he's done is he's picked up this brown, the copper, and he's pushed that saturation back up again. So effectively taking the whole image down, but then picking on that one bit of color. So remember, you're always referring back to the raw image in your color editor, and then pulling that all the way back up again. So you get this rich sort of copper, I guess it's copper, copper/brass, but the way that it's going green there, I'm guessing copper, although they look brass. Yeah. Getting it back to this lovely metallic finish, because without that, let's just turn that off. That desaturation would have pulled everything down, as you can see. Turn that back on again. It pulls this whole image back together and it looks really cool. A little bit, there's stuff around sorting out. So there's some masks over the jug. There's some masks over the shaving brush. We've got a couple of heel layers. There's a couple of bits of stuff that out here on the right, on the wall, and this shadow to lighten that up a little bit. But, honestly, mate, I'd leave it. I think this is great as it is. If you want to use it, and one thing to bear in mind with cropping, and going back to our first image, just bear in mind when you're doing these edits, there is another reason for doing your crop last. Imagine if Paul wanted to make this into a poster with the business name on the left or something like that. Let's go to our crop tool. I'm going to go to unconstrained. So of course, that nice 1/3 line, well, it's a very quick change. Let's just do a quick new heel layer. Oops, sorry, new heel layer. I'm going to pick up here and get rid of that. And we'll also extend our countertop out here. So now we've got a nice ability to put a little, whether it's company logo, whether it's, contact details and all that sort of stuff. So think about doing your edits on the whole image, just in case you then want to crop bigger. Remember, you can always crop smaller, but imagine if Paul had made all those changes only in here, and most of them weren't. Most of them were global changes. So if those changes to color and stuff had only been done in a masked area in here, if someone turns around and says, oh yeah, great, but we need some more space to the left, how are you going to fix that? So genuinely have a think about the position in your workflow when you do that cropping, because it is important. The ability to recover extra stuff is really, really, really important. So yeah, in answer to your question, Paul, is it ready to print? Yes. Maybe this shadow out here, you might want to lift a bit more. You've already got the layer in here to do it. But actually the other option you have got with that is you could, of course, create a new heel If I create one from up here, we could see whether it can get some of this out. It may not do as good a job as a clone, maybe in this case, but we could have a little play with it just to reduce some of that shadowing out there. But it's great. It's a really nice shot and ready to print, I would say. Okay, let's head across to Daniel's shot. So Hawaii. Let's go to Hawaii. Remember as well, in all of these cases, one of the first things that we do before we even touch any of the editing things is put in a lens profile. We haven't talked about it for a while because, to be honest, I'm assuming most people know this now as a process, but as a reminder, before you start editing anything, get your lens profile loaded in. If it doesn't have your exact profile, see if it's got it wrong or it didn't read the EXIF data, load it in yourself manually. If you can't find your own profile, see if it has a manufacturer profile loaded in up here. The manufacturer profile will take all the raw stuff, no issues. If you haven't got a manufacturer profile and you can't find your exact lens, the exact lens you were using, don't be tempted to use some random one. Use generic. Generic does a good job. But if you do use generic, under chromatic aberration, it's going to force you to do what's called an analyze, which checks for chromatic aberration for this image on your sensor at that point in time. That's what we're looking for. In this case, shot at f10, there may be a bit of diffraction out in the distance. There's not really much in the way of sharpness fall off. We've got a couple of challenges with where the focus point was. It's sort of out here in the midpoint somewhere. So I might cheat a little bit and use that sharpness fall off just to bring some extra sharpness to the edges. But overall, from a lens point of view, we're in a pretty good place. We do that on every single shot, regardless of where we're going to next. Always check your lens profile first. On Paul's previous image, he's just said I went in back last night and took the shadow away. Yeah, that would have been my only change to it, honestly. There we go. Joe's just asking, is there a way to see the selected color spot in the image, just like the heel arrows? Oh, to see the origin? No, because effectively when you so let's choose another color spot. If I create a new layer on Paul's image, let's choose maybe this sort of bluey color here. That color spot here, in here it's showing me on the rainbow where it is. It's not going to show me on the image where I picked from, in part because typically from there you're going to start to make some changes in here. And you might move this around a little bit. You might change the smoothness of the fall off of it. You might even move where the origin point is coming from to be able to make some color changes. So it doesn't necessarily have a huge amount of use to know where that source point was from, I guess. If you really wanted to make sure that you had, let's call it accurate anchors, add a color readout here. So you can go to this tool up here, hold the mouse button down, and you've got things like normalize. We can cover that in another session, but you've got a color readout option. So I can click here. Whatever I do now in any image in the same point, it's going to give me that color readout. So I've got it as a reference wherever I go. And of course, if you want to get rid of it, either press the Alt key or the Option key, or go to the Delete Color Readout tool, and off it will go. It's found up here under your White Balance tool. Just hold down the mouse. Okay, so this one, classic landscape in many ways. And Daniel's question was how to get it a bit more rich, how to get it a bit more dramatic, but not necessarily, let's call it overbaking it. So lens profiles loaded in, great stuff. Let's create a new layer for a start. And I'm just going to create a new layer over our sky. So we're actually going to call this layer sky. And let's go there. So there's my mask with a nice gradient on it. And with our sky, you can probably guess what we're going to do, given we've got these lovely clouds, is put in a touch of clarity. Quite a lot of clarity in this case. It needs it because that's looking pretty flat at the moment. And it needs it more than the foreground. That's why I'm not doing it overall. So with my foreground layer, let's do a slightly more subtle effect. Still a gradient, so it's still a gradient layer. But with my clarity, I'm going to pull it up a bit, but nowhere near as much as we did with that sky. The sky can afford to have some tweaks to those outlines of the clouds. What I wouldn't do is push this ground up that much. So if we do really push the ground up in clarity, you start getting this really harsh look. It doesn't look accurate to what was probably there. But overall in this shot, do you know what it does have, funnily enough, is haze. Now in version 20 you won't have this. In version 21 you will. Please use the dehaze tool sparingly and choose the haze color correctly. So at the moment the shadow tone is chosen from auto. In other words, Capture One has analyzed the image and worked out which of the channels seems to have an inordinate amount of color in it. And that's how we're working out whether there's an overall haze to the image. And it's chosen this blue color. So let's just use our dehaze tool to bring back a load of detail. Again, don't go too far. Don't do this. I've seen quite a few people now using dehaze right up to the maximum, and it's just too much. Even this is too much. It needs to keep real. So maybe 20 is enough. Now, if I don't like what it's done in terms of getting rid of the tone, well, I can choose this shadow tone and choose a different one up here, and I'll get very different effects based on the tone that I choose to get rid of as haze. So whether that's from blue, across to pinks, across to greens, but in this case, that blue color is probably the right color for this haze. So that's our background layer. That's done the dehaze across the whole image. We've got a lens spot out here. The old school way of fixing lens spots was to use this one, the remove spot tool. I haven't used that for a long time since healing got a lot better. So again, choose your healing brush. I don't need to create a healing layer. Oh, sorry, Joe, still got your thing on the screen. I don't need to create a healing layer because the first healing brush that I use is going to create that layer automatically. So let's go and create a new heal here. And you'll notice there, what I've done is I automatically, instinctively just chose an origin point. I don't want Capture One to guess for me in this case, especially when we're dealing with things like rocks and landscapes. Because if you get it wrong and you start building brand new rocks, yeah, you know, to fix that dust spot, we've done something probably even worse as a result. Okay, I want to bring out this area here with the waterfalls a bit more and probably this middle band a touch. So let's create a new layer called middle band. And with that layer, let's just use again, a really, really soft edged brush. In this case, I'm going to use quite a low flow as well so that we can control a bit. And as I draw, got auto mask turned on. Very strange. So as I draw and go over things a couple of times, that flow is going to add to that mask, which is different to opacity. So opacity will top out at the number that we set here, in this case 100%. Flow, every time we stroke over the same area, it's adding 22 and 22 and 22, well, percentages anyway. Opacity would be flat, but it would top out at, say, 22 if we put that in there instead. So with our middle band in here, we can afford actually to push a touch more clarity in than out here. We don't want to push it too far. But then on top of that, we can actually use our contrast tool here. Again, not too much. But if we want to add some drama into this, we can use that tool to do it. It can be, I've said it before, a bit of a sledgehammer this, but if used subtly, it's enough to bring out all that texture and detail without pushing things too far. Okay, I think there's been something funny here. So Brian has just said something, which has got the start time wrong, and Alan's just said something, which has got daylight savings. I think the UK went into daylight savings at a different time to the rest of the world. Yeah, sorry. However, you are able to obviously go back to watch this over again, Alan and Brian. So don't worry, you can always watch it later. And in fact, you'll be able to watch the complete meltdown of my computer and my brain on April the 1st. But there we go. So let's go back to Daniel's image and let's talk about the final bit probably in here, which is this foreground here. I want to bring the viewer's eyes out into this middle. And the way we're doing that at the moment is effectively through texture and contrast and clarity. I want to do it through a little bit of exposure too. So I'm just going to add another one called foreground reduce exposure, just to be really specific. I could brush it in. In fact, we will brush it in. I could use a gradient layer if I was being a bit lazy. But in this case, I'm going to use a reasonably sized brush low flow, and turn auto mask off, by the way. One thing as well, just as a reminder, in 21.1 you got the ability to link your brushes with a layer, which means as I go between my different layers, the brush will change to what I was last using on that layer, not a global layer instead. Okay, so let's paint in. I'm going to turn my mask on, so press M on the keyboard to turn the mask, or you can choose here and choose always display, only display while drawing, or never display it, or grayscale. And I'm just going to paint into here a little bit and then double down again. And that's the advantage with flow and opacity to that extent, which is if I add and add and add, we're adding in more and more mask with every single brush stroke. So with that, I can then pull down my exposure. Again, not a lot. This is less than a stop of difference. In fact, we're going to stop there, 0.79 of a stop. But it's enough to just bring the viewer up here into all this detail out here. If I really want that waterfall to pop, just looking at it now, what we could do is, of course, create a waterfall specific layer. Let's go into there, over here. And am I going to do that? Let's think. I can use a bit of clarity there for sure, but I really want that waterfall, the actual waterfall, to pop a little bit. We've got a little bit of a diffraction issue by the look of it on the edge of the image. But what I'm going to do is just create another one called waterfall detail and use a very, very, very small brush. And we're literally just going to paint over that waterfall. And of course we left auto mask on. Not sure what's going on with this layer or this image at the moment. It keeps resetting my brush, which is a bit odd, but in the grand scheme of things that have gone weird today, we'll just leave that one and not talk about it again. So with our waterfall detail, I'm just going to push that contrast up a bit more there, possibly a bit more clarity, but just to make it pop out into the distance. If we don't like that, remember you've got your layer opacity. We can pull that down or pull it up to you. So probably about halfway works for me. And that's it. So Barry's just said, could we Luma range the waterfall? We could, but at that distance with those edges that are quite neat, we don't really need to worry about it, Barry. It's not detailed enough to worry about that much. But again, all of those changes I made, if you remember, are all quite small. We've pushed clarity quite a bit, but they're all incremental changes. The overall effect on this shot is actually quite dramatic. We go from there to there. We've still got our rainbow in here. Of course, with our rainbow, we could use the same trick that we did with Gerry's, which is to add another little automatic layer over here with our little rainbow layer. And with that layer, of course, we can again push in a bit more clarity. The risk is you could lose some of that color, so just be careful doing that. If you push it too far, it's going to be a little bit over the top, but enough just to be able to bring it out into the foreground is kind of good for me. Okay, so there we go. What a fun broadcast today has been, he says with a smile on his face finally. So Tom's image, just correcting that top, well, in fact, not that one, that top corner here. Use heal and clone together. You don't have to use one or the other. You can use both together, but bear in mind that the heal layer, it doesn't matter how many you add on, they're not cumulative, so they're always referring back to the raw image underlying underneath. Gerry's shot here. Again, let's go before and after. Where are we here? So here's our before, which Gerry had already corrected the white balance for. So here was Gerry's original edit on the left. On the right is the new one. That new one uses a style brush, but instead of relying on the style brush as an actual brush, what we've done is we've used the style brush and added a gradient onto that layer. So we've got a nice soft fall off for it. Onto Dominique's, the one that I'd already done some changes to and didn't notice, and also the one that crashed my computer. There we go. There's an accolade. So what we've done here, we've got a vignette around the whole image. We've increased by quite a way the clarity out here in this cloud. We used a Luma range to get rid of the surfer from this mask out in the foreground here. So we keep the surfer in silhouette, rasterize the layer, so we've got a load of masking that we can add into it to make sure that we're brightening the rest of the foreground without brightening the surfer. And then with that extra clarity up in the top, we end up with a really, really cool dramatic image as a result. Pool shot, as I say, I'm not going to change much with it because I don't think there's much wrong with it at all. I think it's a really, really good shot. I'd be very happy with that. So yeah, get that printed big and put it on your wall, Paul. And then Daniel's shot, really cool scene. A couple of things just in terms of getting that haze out. So handily enough, the dehaze tool does a good job with that, as well as the clarity tool, and using clarity selectively. So use different amounts of clarity on the sky to what you do the mountains. It doesn't make sense that you're using a huge amount of clarity on the mountains just because you want the clouds to pop. So separate the layers out. That can work really well. And that's about it. But there we go. So that was a bit more unplanned and unscripted today than normal, but moving on, let's hope that next week we have no more gremlins. In between now and next week, by all means, join in on that Facebook group. We will talk about these images and also all of the other stuff that you guys want to talk about in between now and then. Obviously, over the next 7 days, you've got access to the Pro Tips series in there, in YouTube, in the playlists. In there, you'll see the 21 and 21.1 introductions for those of you that don't have 21. So have a look at there. It shows you the tools that are different. Please continue to send in your images. Send them as either EIP or RAW files. Please remember to include your name. 2 people last week didn't include their name and we struggled to know who we're editing. So please make sure your name is in the detail when you send it in, but poriforlive.wetransfer.com. And between now and next Thursday, which will be the same time, same place, take care. Go out if you're allowed to. Stay home if you're not. And we'll see you then. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.